I've been snowboarding for 18 years, and as someone who could only really afford one board a year, I'm not too interested in the extra tech, extra details of boards. Instead, I care about what works. So this is my no bullshit board guide of how I select a board that will tackle any terrain on the mountain. And the first thing that I want to note is board shape. It's really important to get a full camber snowboard. Why do I say this? It's not because I hate the other shapes, but it's because full camber is the board type that's used the most in Whistler, it's the most powerful, and it's the most consistent. That doesn't mean you can't buy a powder board with a little bit of rocker on the nose to help keep it up, but overall, you'll see the best riders on the mountains using full camber. This is because a full camber board will go in really rail-in turns and have consistent power. If you're watching any contest boarders or anything, they're using it for this reason. And as someone who's road flying V, tried other shapes, I can tell you that full camber snowboards are just way faster, way stronger, more responsive, and give you a lot more power out of the pop. So if you're going and looking at a board, I'd highly recommend focusing on full camber variants. And then if you want to get a POW board, you can add a little bit of rocker in there. Burton and Nitro make most of their boards full camber, and that's one of the reasons why they're some of the best board companies and are consistently making the best boards out there. So if you're looking for a board that can handle any terrain, any mountain, and will just work for everything, full camber is the way to go. Flying V is the other camber that's recommended to beginners. I don't really like it though. The only benefit to Flying V is it's less good at holding edge pressure. This means it's less likely that you'll catch an edge. I personally think that you should learn to snowboard with body mechanics that make edge catching really not a thing. So trying a Flying V will just make it so you have an easier couple of weeks, but overall the board isn't going to go and keep up, and it's not going to let you keep progressing as much. And then something like a full rocker snowboard, it can be fun to go and play around on, but when you start getting to like super big mountain terrain, it's going to be really hard to keep up. What brings us into the next stage, and that is board stiffness. How soft a board is going to really decide a lot of mechanics. I generally think, knowing that every board company uses a slightly different stiffness system, but anything below a 7 shouldn't really be used on the mountain. Maybe a 6 depending on the board, but you really want that little bit of a stiffer board. This is why. A stiffer board will let you handle the chop of the slope, it will let you go and generate more power, it will stay more sturdy, so it will actually protect you and let you build your fundamentals. Where a softer board is going to be a bit more like a noodle. So as you go through chop, as you go and hit terrain, as you hit faster turns, it's going to want to bounce you and pop. And for stuff like freestyle and jumping, it actually doesn't help at all. When you're doing a jump on a snowboard, you're trying to put pressure through your board all the way while keeping it stiff. A more flexy board will make it so it's more likely for the nose to come and flex up at the start, and that's going to make it so you're not getting that clean takeoff. For rails, it's going to make it so it's slightly more soggy. So just overall, a stiffer board is really beneficial. But how do we decide from 7 over to 10, what stiffness do you need? If you're just riding the mountain casually and you're trying to carve, doing big mountain riding, 7 to 8 is absolutely perfect. It can handle everything, that little bit of playfulness is really nice. But if you're riding like really big jumps or really gnarly terrain exclusively, then you can start going to a 9. I don't really know any boards that are a 10 out of 10, let me know in the comments below. But personally, my 9 stiffness boards are as stiff as I can really handle, and I only use those when I'm going 80 kilometers per hour off of a 70-foot jump. So it's really fun having like 7, 8, because it'll give you that little bit of extra pop, that little bit of extra response. The stiffer you go, the more it will charge, but the harder it will be to move. And this doesn't mean there isn't a place for like the stranger cambers, the softer boards, but if you're trying to go and ride the mountain consistently, I wouldn't really recommend it. Those boards are better if you're just trying to have a good time ripping small slopes. Shoop. Next is board shape. There's directional snowboards, there's twin snowboards, and there's boards that are close enough to being twin that it doesn't really matter. This is a directional snowboard, so it's designed for you to go and carve down the mountain, hit powder, and we can really see that it's meant for powder. Wider in the nose, a little bit more short and stubby. It's 151 wide, and this wide is actually really important. Boards usually come in a wide variant and a narrow variant. You want to be using the narrow variant if you're using anywhere from like a size 7 all the way to like the size 10 boot. The reason why you want a wide board is because of toe hang. If you're on too narrow of a board for your boot length, you're going to get something called toe drag. That's where your toes are hanging off the end. And you'll get something called heel drag. That's where your heel's hanging off the end. This makes it so as you rail a turn, your boot actually hits the snow, and it really limits how deep you can get into your turns. So if your foot's bigger than a 10, I'd highly recommend looking into getting a wide snowboard. The downside to using a wide snowboard on more narrow feet is it's going to make it so your board's less responsive because your pressure points are going to be set further away from the edge, slowing down your turns. That's why on something like this, a wider board doesn't really matter because it's a POW board, so your turns are slow, flowy anyway. But if you're trying to have like a high performance park board, you want to make sure you're getting a board that fits the length of your feet as close as possible. And I'm sorry for anyone with size 12, size 13 feet, they really don't make boards wide enough for you guys, and you're always going to have a little bit of that toe and heel drag. This is what I'd call basically a directional snowboard. It has a slightly different tail than nose, but you could ride the Sphinx switch no problem. My favorite board like this is the Nitro Alternator. You can ride it switch. It gets that little bit of extra nose size, so it really helps for powder charging cars. If I was only going to have one snowboard and I wasn't solely focused on park, I definitely get a somewhat directional snowboard just because it really helps go through the powder. It's really fun to rail turns back and forth, and I just find them the most fun snowboard. But if your focus is on freestyle and you're planning on doing a bunch of tricks, you really just want to go for the true twin. And it's just a true twin because it rides the same switch as it does regular. Sometimes we'll have an extra like inch to a couple centimeters on the nose versus the tail, but not enough to really matter. Every board has a weight recommendation on the site, and it's really important to listen to this, but you don't want to only listen to this. If you're like really short and really heavy or really tall and really light, it might not necessarily be true. So the chin test is a pretty safe thing. And as I get better at snowboarding, I generally size up. And if you're riding big mountain, I'd recommend sizing up. So I'm 165 pounds, 5'11", and I ride a 158 to 160 range of board. If I was riding just like smaller mountain, rails, park, I'd probably use like a 158 consistently. And if I'm going and doing powder, bigger jumps, I'd size up to like a 160. So it's pretty flexible, but you just want to make sure that you're getting the board that's the right length, and it's not just ridiculously narrow or ridiculously long on you, even if that's closer to the weight requirements. Because it's really important having the right pressure points and the right angles of the board, and if you have too much nose and tail, it's going to make it pretty hard to ride. There's two different binding mounting systems. There's the bolt system and the quick system. I'm not a big fan of. That's because it only uses 2 bolts, and I find that it gets really loose and I get a lot of sway no matter how tight you do it. The point of this is you can get a really adjustable stance and it's really flexible. The problem is you go and impact it as you tighten your board. So you can't really make micro adjustments once you went and tightened your bindings on the first time. And I've just had so much problems with these. Everyone I know that rides these is constantly dealing with loose bindings. That's why I'd highly recommend the bolt system, just because they have the 4 bolts, you can put them in, you can really adjust it. If you can't get your quite perfect stance, you can always go and put one binding a little bit further and one a little bit farther. So it doesn't need to be perfectly symmetrical, especially because most boards are made with a slightly longer nose than tail. It gives you that little bit of room of flexibility. And the lack of flexibility you have in adjusting your stance, it more than makes up for with just letting your board get secured. I highly recommend getting your screws on there as tight as you can, because as soon as your bindings start sliding one time, they're going to start sliding more. So the tighter you can get them off the bat, the less likely they are going to be to slide in the future. You should never really have your stance at the max narrow setting or the max wide setting. It's just going to be too polarizing. Somewhere in the middle, somewhere with reference stance, if you're buying a board that fits you, then reference stance should be pretty close to what you want, with like 1 or 2 notches back and forth flexibility being reasonable. But maxing out your stance or making it too narrow is going to be one of the biggest things you can do to hold back your riding. So when in doubt, reference it out. When you buy a new snowboard, you actually want to wax it 1 to 3 times, and that means complete wax, complete scrape. This is because the wax they come with isn't very good and it's not going to really protect the base. So taking that extra time to wax your board even before the first day is going to really increase the longevity. For edges though, if you want to go and get on your board and instantly hit a frontside board slide on a sticky rail, you could consider grinding them down. Personally, I've been riding for a long time and I haven't ground down my edges for 8 years, and it hasn't been a problem. If you just take a few laps, do some carving, do some railing, what I'd recommend on a new board, the edges will be good to go. Edge catching normally comes from a mistake in the body mechanics or because the rail's sticky or there's a little bit of funk on the rail. So wax the board, but don't really worry about the edge. You can go and sharpen them when they're getting dull, but other than that, you can just leave them be. And that brings us into the last point, longevity of a snowboard. The stiffer the board, the more life it will really have. That's because boards nowadays are usually built so well they don't snap. If your board does snap, I'd highly recommend going and trying to warranty it, because I haven't snapped a board in like over 10 years. So if you ride the boards properly, how they're supposed to be ridden, snapping just doesn't really happen. This means they start getting looser though. So boards, instead of snapping, generally just get softer over time. So 100 days in, you'll start feeling the board a little bit more warpy, a little bit less responsive. If it's like an 8 stiffness, dropping down to like a 6 stiffness, nothing too significant. And then 200 days, you can start feeling it sort of like a noodle. It really depends on how you ride, how you're doing it, but that's how to sort of tell if you need a new snowboard. Is your snowboard not feeling snappy and responsive? Is it feeling like a noodle? Then it can be time to get a new board. The other great indication is edge cracks. Snowboards, as they start breaking in, bending, will get little cracks on the edges. I know some dudes who get boards for free, by the way, will replace their board as soon as it gets an edge crack. Me, I'm a more 8 to 12 edge crack kind of guy. I'm not really worried about it. Maybe a little bit of D-lam, maybe a little bit of funk, but I'll generally ride my boards until I'm convinced that they're completely done. And that's the big thing. Snowboards are expensive, they're an investment, so it's really important to pick the board that's best for you. That's why I highly recommend getting a full camber board. If you want to ride more PAL, more big mountain, look into a directional board, maybe with a little bit of rocker on it. At the end of the day, choosing a snowboard is about choosing what you like. So if you want to experiment, get wild with like some battalions, or you're really into like the Never Summer tech, go for it. But there's a reason why you see so many good snowboarders using full camber, and that's just because they work in almost every situation. So if you learned something new in this video, I'm happy I could help, and yeah, good luck shopping and have a good winter season.